Great. Okay. We are live on Facebook. We are live here on Zoom. Thank you so much for everybody who is watching live. Thank you to those of you in the future who are watching this recorded on YouTube or however you're watching it. This is, for those of you who stumbled on this by accident, my name is Steve Owens. I'm a candidate for state representative here in the 29th Middlesex District, which covers 3/4 of Watertown and most of West Cambridge. And I have been, for the past few weeks, hosting town halls with experts in policy and other issue advocates. And today, for my fourth meeting, we are very, very lucky to have former Transportation Secretary Jim Aloisi. You may have read his prolific tweets. You may have read his insightful commentary in Commonwealth Magazine, which I always make it a point to read. He is a great advocate for our transportation system. He is on the Board of Transit Matters. Is that right?
Yeah, that's
okay.
Right. Yeah.
And thank you so much, Jim. Thanks for coming. I really appreciate it.
I'm glad to be here, Steve, and glad that you're, introducing this topic in the campaign because it's an important one. Obviously, it affects everybody's lives. So let's have a good conversation.
Yeah, great. So I was saying before we went live, Jim and I had a nice conversation very early in this process, and he was the last person I talked to before the world closed down for the pandemic. And at that point, the real topic of conversation was the transportation bond bill that the House had passed, right? So they had they passed a gas tax increase. They passed restructuring the corporate minimum tax. They had passed I think there were fees for Uber and Lyft for TNCs on there as well. And there was some measure of rural equity, or regional equity. So they had some money for rural and regional RTAs, and as well as for the MBTA, of course. Is that off the table now? The speaker seems to say that he still wants to move forward. The Senate seems a little bit more squeamish about it. Are we now talking about no changes to funding for that, do you think?
Well, so it's an important issue that was, no pun intended, derailed by the COVID-19 pandemic. The House seems to want to continue to advance it, although with some changes. I was on a podcast with the chairman of the House Transportation Committee, Bill Strauss, who was expressing reluctance to go forward with the gas tax increase in light of the pandemic. Now we know people are driving more, there's congestion happening more. By definition, if you're driving during commuting hours, you're working. I actually think this is a good time to raise the gas tax. The price of gas is quite low, but it remains to be seen whether that's going to be the view of the legislature. The Senate doesn't seem to be interested in doing a larger scale bill anymore.
Right.
And so the last I understood is they were sending over, there were two bills actually. There was a bond bill and there was a separate financing bill. And I think the Senate is going to, from what I understand, may just be sending over the bond bill with some policy issues attached to it. But it won't have a gas tax. I'm not sure what it will do about ride hailing. I think both the legislative bodies want to figure out the continuation of the MBTA's governance body, the Fiscal Management Control Board.
And that would expire very soon, right? If they do nothing.
By law at the end of the month.
Yeah.
And so I think, agree or disagree with the board, on the whole, I think most people, myself included, think they've done a good job. These people in particular. And so I'm hoping that they'll get some extension because there are too many issues involving public transportation right now that changing, the proverbial changing horses in the middle of the stream doesn't seem to me to make sense.
Yeah.
And so we'll see. I'm hopeful that will happen.
So let's talk then a little bit that. Just unwind what you think a post-COVID uh, MBTA is going to look like. I've had lots of conversations with people because we're Watertown and Cambridge rely heavily on the T, obviously.
Mhm.
I've had a lot of conversations with people. They come, they know I've worked in transportation. I've professionally, and they ask me about it, and I get comments like, I don't know if I'm gonna take the T anymore. I don't know if I'm gonna feel
Yeah,
comfortable taking the T. And what we've seen now is we've seen increases to driving, as you mentioned.
right.
I mean, commuter rail was down 95% during the peak of the epidemic. I don't know if it's how much, that's come back now. I can't imagine it's still zero.
Not
It's
much.
still at basically zero, but I don't think it's come back very much. So what do you envision as a post-COVID MBTA or more generally a public transportation system?
Well, I think it's going to be different in material ways, but it can all be different in a good way. And so step back for a second and you think about why we have why is transportation important? Why is transit important? It's because people need access to places, right? They need access to jobs, they need access to schools, to healthcare, to opportunity. Um, in a world where more people may still be telecommuting, then they don't need that same access. Other people may need more access. So one of the things we've seen during the height of the pandemic was the resilience and durability of bus transit. So you're right, commuter rail really was down by over 90%. Subway was also down significantly. Bus, on the other hand, many bus routes were maintaining 30, 40, 50% capacity. Now, those bus routes are the bus routes that are carrying essential workers, a lot of them lower wage workers. It's the 28 bus from Mattapan and the 22 from Roxbury Dorchester and the Silver Line 5 from Nubian Square and the 111 from Chelsea. And so we need to think about the role that bus has played even at the height of this and will continue to play. Number one. Number two, another observation to make is there may be people who are changing mode from transit or rail, particularly intercity rail, commuter rail, to driving. There are a lot of people in the inner core that have changed mode sustainably from transit to walking, if they can, or to cycling. And so for me, that means we need to think about this problem holistically. We need to think about how to encourage more people who want to cycle to do so safely. That means safe, protected lanes. How do we encourage people to walk safely? That means in many places wider sidewalks. If we're going to have small business recover in neighborhoods and in neighborhood business districts, particularly restaurants and places like that, we need wider sidewalks to offer three-season functionality. And I think we need dedicated bus lanes in order to achieve what we need to achieve with bus transit, which is reduce crowding. You reduce crowding by increasing capacity. You increase capacity in part by increasing frequency. And this is not magic, right? You run more buses more frequently, you'll have less crowding. And everything I have read about COVID is that having protection, everybody wearing masks, having some distance, and staying in, if you're in a place with other people, not staying there for long, long periods of time. Those are three key elements to reducing your risk. So you want the bus to be faster. You don't want to have people spending a lot of time on a bus. All of these things point to a multi-governance approach to the solution, meaning the T doesn't control city streets. The T
Right.
doesn't control the public realm. The municipality does that. The municipality doesn't control the bus service delivery model. So one of the things I've been talking about is the renewed importance on the part of municipalities and the T to collaborate on a comprehensive plan to reimagine the public realm in a way that will increase the safety and reliability of bus transit but also increase the safety of cycling and walking, and think about the streetscape very differently. We don't want to return to a new normal that's the old normal,
Right.
because that
And
kind of led us to the problem we've got today.
And we're seeing actually now a lot of municipalities doing interesting things with their streetscapes.
Mhm.
We've got the North End is got outdoor dining now. Belmont Center just or restricted their main street through there to get outdoor tables. We're talking more about it here in Watertown, and even at the beginning, in the middle of the pandemic, they closed. DCR closed a section of Greeno Boulevard in Watertown by the Arsenal, just to allow people to spread out as they walk, as they bike along the river. And I think, for the most part, I mean, that was very successful, I thought. And in terms of allowing people to get outside in a safe way, so that they are not cheek to jowl on the river paths, which is we saw in some of the the trustees and some of the other DCR places where everybody was trying to get out and there was no place to go because everything was closed.
Yes.
So I think that is something that we are going to want to see. Cambridge has done a lot as well, very recently, closing off some of their streets to through traffic to encourage cycling. How do we deal with the kind of competing interests, though? Even with a bus dedicated lane and a cycling and walking, we've got that in front of Mount Auburn Cemetery, for instance, and the real estate there is very small. It's a very narrow set of lanes. So there's a lot of in and out. It works for the bus very well. For the cyclists, I've heard some get a little nervous, but how can we encourage more creative solutions like that?
Yeah, I mean, every streetscape is going to be different by definition. It's not the easiest thing to do, but we need to get city planners and T planners to really collaborate, and there are a lot of folks locally in academia and elsewhere who can be helpful in sort of thinking creatively about each as a unique opportunity to provide what I call the sustainability response to COVID, right? One of the things we know for sure, based on 3 reports that I've seen over the past month and a half, one from Harvard, one from BU, one from Cambridge University in the UK, is that long-term exposure to particulate matter increases your chances of COVID mortality. And particulate matter is what cars spew out, right? Different than greenhouse gas, but really just as bad, if not worse, when it comes to causing underlying conditions and vulnerabilities, whether it be asthma or lung disease. And so there's a public health reason now to think about limiting vehicular traffic in the inner core. And we haven't done it. We're still not doing a good enough job at it as we see congestion rise. And we need to think about this now, both as a mobility issue and a public health issue. We're not trying to punish people who want to drive in cars, but we are trying to say, look, there are impacts to this that are affecting many, many people.
Yeah.
And we've got to do something about it. One way to do something about it is to change the streetscape. But the T needs to do its end to cooperate by running more service more frequently, by doing some of the things that they announced today. I've been calling for several weeks for the T to facilitate mask wearing, not enforce it, because we don't want to get police involved. And now they're doing that at various stations. They're actually handing out masks if you don't have one. We should.
Well, that's great. I hadn't heard that. That's important.
That's important. It's a really big deal. And so, if you look at what they're doing, for example, in San Francisco, they've changed the service planning there so that there are several subway lines that will now stop and not go the whole route. And you need to transfer it to another in order to help them increase their own frequency. So frequency is a big issue when you're trying to reduce crowding on a trolley or a train. It's the best way to do that. And then if you think about the public realm, you want bus stops that are generously sized so people are not crowded in waiting areas, right? All of these things are synergistic. And it is going to require a new collaboration between cities and the T an interesting side note, one of the differences in the House bill and the Senate bill when it comes to the reconstituted Fiscal Management Control Board, the House bill requires that a city of Boston representatives sit on the board. The Senate bill is requiring that it be someone representing the advisory board, which is basically all the cities and towns. I've actually suggested both. I
Yeah.
think, I know it's not the district, but Boston, for whether we like it or not, has an outsized impact and is outsizedly impacted by the T. But I also think you need to have representation from other cities and towns on the board that decides policy, because I think that was right before, but now in the moving toward hopefully post-COVID world, however long that takes, we need to think about how the governance structure works so it's more responsive to these needs.
Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, it makes Boston obviously makes sense because most of the trips are going to begin or end there. I mean, we for
Right.
whatever it's worth, it's a hub and spoke network where you got to go into the city center to get just about anywhere
Sure.
if you want, even if you want to go back out. You know, we feel, you know, I know in Watertown we felt kind of like ignored by the T because we don't have commuter rail, we don't have the MBTA, the subways. But we do have, I mean, and we do have, what we do have is trackless trolleys and
Right.
express buses, which are great.
Mhm.
But in terms of, I do want to, speaking of the trackless trolleys, I want to go back to your point about particulate. What would it take, do you think, to electrify, not necessarily using what we have here, but electrify the MBTA, the bus system, and even the commuter rail?
So,
Because one of the things that you mentioned, let's get this particulate out. Let's make sure that we are protecting those communities that 50 years ago we decided to drive a highway through,
mhm.
and see what we can do to alleviate some of their breathing conditions for by getting rid of that.
I think it's a big issue. It's a very big issue on commuter rail. Right now, we're using dirty diesel locomotives. They spew out a lot of black soot, black carbon. That's very nasty stuff, and it is bad for the lungs. It's bad for the environment. The diesel locomotive is also bad economically. They fail frequently. It's old technology, very expensive to maintain. And so one of the things that I've been calling for through my work in transit matters has been a new regional rail system that's using what we call electric multiple units. They're not electric locomotives. Amtrak uses electric locomotives. An electric multiple unit is like a subway car. It has its own internalized energy system. That would eliminate not just the pollution from commuter rail locomotives, it would actually make the systems more reliable, because an EMU, an electric multiple unit, is 400, not 4, not 40, 400 times more reliable than a diesel locomotive. The metric is mean distance between failures, and the EMU just blows diesel away. And it's not new technology, it's widely used globally. So the Fiscal Management Control Board in November actually directed the T to hire staff and to begin to introduce electrification on the commuter rail system in a phased approach from Lynn to Boston, along the Fairmount line and the Providence line, because the Providence line, if you imagine it, is already electrified because Amtrak runs on it. And so we wouldn't have to pay for a lot of the upfront costs of actually putting up catenary. It's already there. So that's part one. Part two, battery electric bus is still somewhat immature as a technology. And all of the examples I'm aware of globally is that its immaturity really is on display in colder climates. So if you look at battery electric bus in places like Moscow, introduced the whole fleet. They had to buy an additional half fleet just because the ones that they had kept losing power in the cold. Trolley electric, on the other hand, is old, durable, proven, reliable electric bus. It's just the trolley electric bus. I know some people have aesthetic issues with it. I personally, I don't. I think it's kind of charming, but
I will say that, living here with the trackless trolleys, a half block, when they run diesel, I don't like it as much as when they
right.
run electric, because you can
Sure.
tell when that diesel bus pulls away.
Yeah, yeah. So I think we need to, what I think we need to do is stick to the trackless trolleys, the trolley electrics. Don't, some people want to get rid of them. It's like, let's not get rid of what works. And then let's begin the migration to battery electric when we're more confident that the technology is mature enough. Now, there's a long lead time because you've got to build maintenance depots that you can fit these buses in. They're differently sized, and you also have, they're differently maintained. They need to be stored mostly indoors, not outdoors. So there's a lot the T can do to prepare for that day. And that's what I think they need to be doing to lead in this effort. Will transforming the T into an all-electric system solve the particulate matter issue? No, it won't. But the T needs to lead. And so I think it needs to do that. On a larger scale, the Commonwealth needs to think about the eventual transition to electric vehicles, which will happen over time, but it will take a longer lead time, I think, for that technology to mature, and also to think about, widespread, ubiquitous, and equitable charging infrastructure. Where's that going? How's that working? So the era of EVs is probably not in the very short term, but it will come. And I think the state needs to think about, for example, one of the things I suggested when the speaker a year and a half ago called on the business community to give him ideas about transportation bill. I said, well, how about this? Why don't we give the business sector, the developers, real estate holders, some tax incentive to install EV charging infrastructure, right? In the whole history of the world, the public sector never built and never ran a gas station, right? Doesn't do that. I mean, there might be a gas station that in a state police depot, but generally it's a private sector initiative. Why do we think that electric vehicle charging infrastructure will be anything other than a private sector initiative, right? It probably will be. So let's figure out how to incentivize people who are owning, it's the private sector that owns the garages, that own most of them, that owns the surface parking lots, most of them, and who are building the buildings that people will park in. So give them some incentive to begin that process of rolling out the charging infrastructure so it's in place before that's something legislators can noodle on and think about as a way to think about how we prepare for that future, right? The problem is we often don't prepare for the future. So when the future becomes today and tomorrow, we're not ready for it.
And that seems to be one of those things that we can ensure happens, because one of the things limiting electric vehicles is, well, I've got to charge it. I can't, maybe I can't go quite as far as I want to go and back without charging in between. If the infrastructure is there, then there's more incentive for me as a consumer to say, all right, well, if I can charge my thing at work, and I know that there's 10 charging stations instead of one, so I can I can get into the garage, I can park it, be relatively sure that I'm going to be able to get back home on the charge. I think that's something that it's not exactly a chicken. It's like a virtuous circle. The more charging infrastructure we have, the more likely it is that I'm going to consider an electric vehicle. The more likely it is that your next project is going to say, well, gosh, even without a tax structure, I've got all these people that, who are driving electric. I'm going to need this as a benefit for my employees.
Exactly.
As opposed to things like that. Okay, yeah. So the parking thing actually brought something to my mind, because I know that the Globe a while back did a study that showed that so many of the downtown um, job, the businesses will give their employees parking as a
Oh,
benefit.
it's a huge problem.
And and I know that my company in particular would give me a parking space, but they wouldn't give me a T-Pass because it came out of a different
Right,
budget. So they would pay the, however many $100 a month for the parking space, but not for and not even a commuter rail pass, just a
right.
regular old monthly T-Pass. Is there something we can do to make sure that the cost of parking is built in to people's decisions? It seems like if parking
Yeah,
is free, then why not drive?
it, it's it is maybe the most important factor in why people opt to drive more. You know, it's a hidden subsidy, really.
Yeah.
I just was the thesis advisor for a master's student at MIT who did his thesis was how to manage congestion in Metro Boston. And he did a survey of drivers, commuters in Metro Boston, 405 people. 70, I think it's 73% of the people who responded said they had free or subsidized parking at work. Now, I knew that a lot of people had it. I didn't realize it was that much. That's a lot. Now, the mayor of Boston has a bill in the Senate that was filed on his behalf by the Senate Transportation Chair, Joe Boncory, that would give him the power to put a fee or a tax on non-residential parking spaces in the city. The reason for that is the municipalities don't have the independent power to do that. They need, under the Home Rule, Massachusetts Home Rule Amendment, they need legislative authority. I think it's a good bill. I think they should give the mayor that authority. They might give every mayor or a town manager that authority and then make it a local option. But it's real money that would end this part of the subsidy for auto mobility. And then you could redirect the revenue from that to sustainable mobility. It would be, there are the big issue constantly is the lack of funding resources. And, you got to be both creative and fair in the way you raise revenue. And, a subsidy for parking to me is like a pretty fair way to say, we got to at least cut into that at some level, because what you're doing, your impacts by driving into the downtown and not taking commuter rail are significant enough that it warrants some assessment. And we're going to use that money to maybe invest in a better commuter rail so that you might take that and not drive, or we're going to use that money for complete streets, or whatever the case may be.
So Sarah on the chat brings up brings up congestion charging, congestion pricing. One of the things that was interesting to me about some of the COVID time data that we got for the Pike, for example, the Mass Pike, for example, was there was still a peak, but the peak was a little bit earlier for people coming into town. So it seemed like the people who were the essential workers, the ones who had to come in, were already not off peak, but they were earlier than your typical 9 to 5 office worker anyway.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if any of that gives us some information about how we might do a congestion pricing. And now that hey, now that we've got the stanchions, we don't have to worry about tolling infrastructure as much.
Right.
Is there an opportunity there, or do you think that again it's one of those things that like the gas tax, people are going to be really touchy about until we come out of this?
Anytime we raise money, people are touchy about it. So that's just a fact of life. So the Senate, I thought, was going to, but I don't know that it'll happen now, but I thought they might be in the position of wanting to propose a pilot program for congestion pricing within Metro Boston. When you talk about pricing roads, you can do it any number of ways. You can price a road like we price the Turnpike, which is not congestion pricing, it's just all day toll. You can price a road by time of day. You can price a road by traffic flow, Or you can do what they did in London, which is, it's called cordon pricing, which is when you cross a certain boundary, you get charged, right? So there are all kinds of variations on the pricing theme, and you sort of think about and select the one that you think is more responsive to fairness and more responsive to the needs. We should be, my view, piloting something to prove its efficacy. There is a big regional equity issue that I know the Senate president cares a lot about because she lives out in the West,
Right.
which is the only roads we price are the turnpike and then the tunnels and the bridge. And so there is a regional equity disparity. And if you think about the metropolitan highway system, you would, and if you wanted to toll that or congestion price it, you would include other roads.
Mhm.
So there's another complicating factor, which is Congress would have to act in some way to let us toll other interstates, because you can't toll the interstate system easily under current federal law. It's maybe too complicated to get into in depth here, but Congress would need to act if you wanted to toll 93 or 95, for example. The other thing is you need to think about doing it in a way where you're not forcing people from one road to another. So you need to think about an area that you're going to price and create a sort of comprehensive pricing arrangement so you're not inadvertently pushing people to an unpriced road that they might choose to take and then causing real havoc, right?
Right.
But we should do it. And there are ways we can begin to do it. Again, it takes leadership at the State House level. There was a plan to do a federally funded pilot a few years ago under a program called the VPPP program, Value Pricing Pilot Program, which we're still eligible for. But the governor vetoed it, so we didn't do it. It would have cost us nothing. It was completely federally funded. Those are the kinds of things at some point the legislature, I think, needs to engage in a thoughtful way, knowing that just like the gas tax, nobody likes to pay more for anything. Who does? But we have a regionally unfair system right now. And we need to think about, particularly if we're going to transition over time to electric vehicles, once we do that, there's no more gas tax, right?
Yeah.
So we do need to think about what's the future like and how do we begin to introduce it here in Massachusetts?
Yeah, I know there was a pilot for the vehicle miles travel tax a few years ago that people were interested in.
Right.
I find that that if it's just a matter of, you go, you get your registration, it says, oh, I drove like 5,000 miles, that's my number. There are other people who want a much more technocratic solution to that, where they put a device in your car that GPSs, so you don't get charged for driving, and you only get charged for driving in Massachusetts, and that seems to have some privacy issues that and also some technology issues that maybe I think are.
The privacy issues have been, actually, they've proven that you can resolve them. They've done some testing in Oregon where it works more like an odometer, right? They just know how many miles you traveled, but they're not tracking your origin or your destination. These days, if you have an iPhone or smartphone,
yeah, I guess the horses left the barn. The horses definitely left the barn on where you are at all times.
You think about the system we have now on the highways that tell you the real-time traffic data, 20 miles, 20 minutes. How do you think they get that? They're getting that because they're reading your Bluetooth signal coming off your smartphone, right? So it's already with us, not to mention all the other stuff that you've got on your phone. So I just wonder whether reasonable expectations of privacy in the 21st century are the same as they were 20, 30 years ago. I'm not against privacy by all means, but if you think about the life we live today, realistically, we've kind of given up quite a bit, whether we like it or not. If we're on Twitter or Facebook, or we're using Google or Amazon, or the Bluetooth is on, so the thing is detecting us down the highway, which it's doing today. That's our life.
and I know as somebody who works with transportation data a lot, particularly freight data, having that access to those sorts of information is very valuable when you're trying to do planning as a state entity, even trying to figure
Sure.
out how things are going. So you know
You need to balance it. I mean, the reality is we have, in my personal opinion, we've got, a federal administration right now that makes people very wary of giving up their privacy. And I appreciate that. But the reality is, if we're going to move to some kind of pricing scheme, technology has to operate in some way. We got to figure out the way that is most comfortable for people.
so
And
yeah.
I noticed that someone asked, if the tea was more reliable, more people would take it. I agree. The issue with pricing is twofold. It can cause people to shift away from driving. You don't want to shift 100% of the drivers, by the way. If you shifted 100%, if you shifted 50% of the drivers to transit, you'd overwhelm transit. So when you're talking about modal shift, you're really talking about shifting 10, 15% of drivers to transit. And yes, the T needs to do a better job, but some of the funding that could make that happen would come from pricing. Pricing is also an alternative to the gas tax. It's another way to use transportation sources for transportation revenue. And so all of these things come to bear in making policy decisions. I said, it's not, sometimes there's no right or wrong answer. You got to be thoughtful about what are you trying to achieve. If you're trying to achieve a reduction in congestion and you're also trying to find a new revenue source that's not the gas tax, pricing becomes perhaps the best way to achieve that. Now, I know some people think, well, we can do other things. There's the fair share income tax idea. There's people talk about the sales tax every now and then. I'm reluctant to go outside of the transportation arena if I don't have to, because we got plenty of other needs in the Commonwealth, education and public safety and public health. So I'd rather not have transportation competing with those other important needs unless we have to have it compete. And if we know we can get the transportation revenue from transportation sources, I think that's the first place we ought to be looking.
I know there's a movement to have regional ballot initiatives that will allow for regional funding sources for some of the, not just for the MBTA, but also for, out in Worcester or Springfield, some of the RTAs where you could raise a little bit of, money just from the service area of those things as a way to link, link the service area with the cost, with the benefit. Because I know a lot of times, especially talking to some folks about TCI, for example, which we didn't touch on, but they're worried about a carbon tax on out in Western Massachusetts and having all that money go to the T.
Sure.
Because they see like, well, I'm paying more, but I'm not getting anything out of it. So I think linking some of those even regional transit authorities with their own funding sources can be very helpful in a way that makes it more politically palatable. If I live in Worcester, I know that money is going to the WMA or
it's essential. If you don't have if whatever you're introducing doesn't have true regional equity, it's going to be really hard to get enough people to want to enact it into law. The rep from Amherst has the same vote as the rep from Cambridge, who has the same vote as the rep from Concord. So we got to be mindful of the legitimate concerns that people have, that if they're going to be asked to pay, they want to see some improvements locally. That's achievable. We just got to say, look, here's how we're going to do it, and do it in a way that's transparent and fair. If you tie TCI to where the gas is pumped, it's one way to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's, you can see that it probably more is pumped east of 495 than west of 495. But you balance it out. But I think you do need to be practical. We who live in this part of the state need to, and I saw this when I was secretary, need to understand that people feel like they often get overlooked out in the western part of the state. And if you want a consensus that can pass a bill in the legislature, you need to figure out how to work that through, just like you would, nationally, at a national level. The states in the Northeast need to find partners elsewhere to get bills passed.
Right.
And we're all one Commonwealth, so I don't see any reason to object to it. I think they deserve good regional transit. They deserve cleaner air. They deserve the mobility needs that suit their needs, just as we do ours.
So if you had, so we're about to time, but as I know, you had a stop coming up, but so I do want to thank you again for coming by.
My pleasure.
Yeah, if anybody's got any last questions, you can put them into the chat, and we'll see if we can get to them quickly. I do. Oh, it looks like Carol turned off her video, but I want to thank your sister Carol for making the introduction. The most important, I forgot when I introduced you, the most important introduction is that you're Carol Aloisi's brother.
Exactly. Exactly.
But yeah, so thanks for coming. Oh, there she is. Hey, Carol. So yes, I want to thank you for coming by. If there was, so we're next year, this budget isn't even done yet. They've got just 1/12 and maybe 1/12 after that, and we'll see how it goes. Next year is going to be, is going to be. I was looking at $6 billion, $7 billion in the hole, I think.
Yeah, it's going to be ugly.
Is there some bang for your buck, or low cost, transportation thing that you would say, all right, well, we can't revolutionize everything, but here's something that we can get a lot of bang for our buck out of it.
Well, what I talked
low
about,
budget time.
Yeah, what I talked about earlier, safe, protected, dedicated bus lanes.
Mm-hmm.
They're not that expensive. It's paint.
You can do them with cones and paint. Yeah.
Cones and paint. It doesn't have to look pretty. We are in the middle of a massive, what I would call pattern break. These pattern breaks happen historically over time. Think about 9/11. It was a pattern break. Things changed afterwards. What changed? The way you flew changed.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the streetscape in front of public buildings, that changed. All of a sudden, there are barriers, right? At first, they were ugly, concrete barriers. Now, many places, you go to downtowns, they're nicely landscaped, they're beautiful. Over time, they change. But life changed. Life is going to change again because of this pattern break. It'll be different. So, the dedicated bus lane might not look as pretty on day one as it will in year 3. But those are very, bus improvements like dedicated lanes and cycling lanes are the least expensive and the most heavily impactful ways to make change in the short term. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to see that happen more and more, because I think it's necessary.
All right.
All right.
That's great. I think you're right. The worst thing we can do is go back to the problems that got us to the congestion and the squeezed streets that we had before. So again, Jim, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. For those of you watching, to find out more about me, you can go to votesteveowens.com. Emerson put the links all in the chat. So thank you all for attending. Thank you for all of you on Facebook watching. I'm gonna turn off Facebook Live and unmute everybody if they want to say hi and bye, and then we'll see you next week. It's Wednesday. Tuesday? Emerson, Tuesday or Wednesday?
Should be Tuesday.
Tuesday. Okay, next week on Tuesday, I've got Quentin Palfrey, the former candidate for Lieutenant Governor. He's going to be talking about the Voter Protection Corps. So he's working on voter protection issues now, and we're going to have a nice conversation about voting. So great. So thank you, everybody. And take care, Jim. Thank you.
Bye-bye.